So, switching focus from the Americas, we're going to leave the fur trade and instead we're going to begin talking about the globalization of the spice trade. Now, we've already discussed the situation in Europe in and around the 14th, 15th, early 16th century. Thanks to the Crusades, Europe begins to reintegrate itself into the big trade routes in Eurasia. However, middle of the 1400s, the Ottoman Empire begins to grow. They conquer Constantinople, effectively cutting Western Europe off from the major trade routes. And Western European states begin to look for ways around this Muslim dominated system of trade. Initially, that comes through Italy, where Italian city states begin to negotiate trade deals with the Ottoman Empire. But pretty soon, these Italian city states, Venice in particular, begin to monopolize on the Mediterranean trade network. And so prices continue to skyrocket in Western Europe for these Asian goods. So the Portuguese are the first to address this by systematically exploring the west coast of Africa in order to find a direct route to the Indian Ocean. Now, in 1498, Vasco da Gama is the first successful one to round the southern tip of Africa, make his way to Madagascar, and then from there to India. And this is a pretty crucial moment, not only in the history of Western Europe, but also in the history of the Indian Ocean trade. The Indian Ocean trade network at this point is well over 2,000 years old. And for the majority of that history, this has been a relatively peaceful, a relatively open, and a relatively low maintenance trade network. The different empires that have come and gone during this time participate and they make money off of this trade, but very few of them have ever tried to control it. And Europeans are going to attempt to change that, somewhat successfully, somewhat not. So, with Europeans having direct access to the Indian Ocean for the first time, Portuguese merchants begin setting up settlements and trading posts up and down the east and west coast of Africa. And the profits from this direct line to India are astronomical. In some cases, Portuguese merchants are selling their goods for 15 to 20 times what they bought it for. And obviously, this kind of profit is going to attract interest from other states in Western Europe. Now, the Portuguese, although they are the first successful entrants into the Indian Ocean trade, find it difficult to integrate themselves the way that they had hoped, mainly because European goods are not in high demand in Asia. The products are either unpopular, things like wool and fur, which tropical and temperate climates really have no use for, or they are not as high quality as the well manufactured goods from China and from India. Now, on top of this, unlike in the Americas, where disease came and cleared a path for the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, and the British, that doesn't take place in the Indian Ocean. Indians and Africans and Southeast Asians and even Chinese have long histories of experience with the types of diseases that Europeans have experience with. So there's no large scale population die out. Then, to make that even more difficult, the states and the kingdoms in the Indian Ocean basin are well established. These are not small scale Indian tribes that can just be simply bullied with a few cannon and a few muskets. This is Qing China, this is the Mughals, this is the Ottomans. These are not, political entities to be pushed around. So you see very little colonization by the Portuguese during this time period. Instead, what they do is they begin setting up what we call a trading post empire. And what these are, well, I don't want to say small, but relatively small, fortified trading posts along the coast of the Indian Basin. In some cases, they are able to take control of entire cities, especially in East Africa. And from these trading posts, they raid and destroy native ports. They use their naval technology and their military advancements to terrorize uncooperative cities. They also commit piracy, they extort foreign merchants, they tax, trade in and out of their own ports and out of other major ports throughout the entire trade network. And in the process of doing this, the Portuguese also caused some pretty significant damage within the Indian Ocean network. One of the most significant things that they do is, in order to fortify their position in East Africa, they end up destroying and subjugating the majority of the Swahili city states that had existed along the East African coast for several hundred years at this point. And one of the reasons that this is so significant is those Swahili city states were some of the most powerful African states at the time. And by wiping them out and destroying that power base, what you see is that even though the Swahili people and the Swahili language survives into modern day, you never see a large scale Swahili state or Swahili kingdom rise in East Africa ever again. Also, during this time period, the Portuguese open up Africa and India to Christian missionaries, and they are particularly aggressive in converting Africans to Christianity, which is going to set a trend that is going to intensify over the next couple of centuries. And when we get to imperialism, we'll talk about how all of that comes to a head. Now, this map is actually from your textbook. I think it's on page, I want to say 679, 677, around there. But what it gives you is an idea of how Europeans go about integrating themselves into this trade network. Because they are unable to colonize the same way that they were in the Americas, they are relegated to taking control of strategic areas in and around the Indian Ocean network. You can see that the Portuguese gain control over most of the east coast of Africa. The Dutch gain control of a number of the Spice Islands in Southeast Asia. But what you see is that even with their trading post empires, the Europeans are never able to directly challenge the major powers in the Indian Ocean. They're never able to directly challenge China, the Mughals in India, the Ottomans in the Middle East. So that is going to be a point of contention in the Indian Ocean over the next several hundred years. And again, when we get to imperialism a couple of units down the road, we're going to talk about how the Western Europeans kind of turn the tide and they begin to overtake the Indian Ocean trade and overtake these major empires